Well, the Kings have bought into whatever Doug Christie has been preaching, and shoot, brother, I've bought back into the Kings as well. Last night against the Heat, the Kings mounted a 17-point fourth quarter comeback, forced overtime, and then with a little over a minute to go in OT, came back from being down 5 and forced a second overtime before eventually pulling away in double OT thanks to 9 straight points from DeRozan. One of the most incredible games I've seen in a long time. Reminded me a little bit of the double OT game against the Clippers a couple of years ago, but instead of, insane offense and shot making, it was insane defense and just straight effort down the stretch. In some ways, this feels like a completely different team than the one we saw just a few weeks ago. In other ways, this feels like the same team, just with more Keon Ellis. But they've also been showing more fight, which, goes back to the whole buying in thing. But what's really stood out to me during this 5-game win streak is the effort the Kings have been showing on the defensive side of the floor, which is obviously something that we had seen from this group before, just not on a consistent basis, and definitely not during that 5-game losing streak that ultimately cost Mike Brown his job. And, part of me feels for Mike because, where the hell was this effort 2 weeks ago? But also, what does that say about Mike that now that he's gone, the Kings have pulled off multiple double-digit fourth-quarter comebacks. They've performed extremely well in the clutch. Keon Ellis, who is getting DNPs consistently, is now undoubtedly one of the Kings' biggest contributors. He's their best defender, currently their best three-point shooter, and he just had the game of his life last night. Sabonis said it himself. We don't win these games without Keon. The Kings' numbers with Keon on versus off the court are insane. On the court, the Kings have an offensive rating of 121.5 and a defensive rating of 110.6. Off the court, they have an offensive rating of 111.6 and a defensive rating of 115.7. That's an insane difference. Almost a 15-point difference. Needless to say, Keon's incredible. Makes you wonder why Mike refused to play him at times, especially when defense and three-point shooting, two things that Keon excels at, were the two things that the Kings were lacking the most. And as more time passes since Mike Brown's firing, the more we're starting to hear from the players. And, they're not, coming out and saying that they didn't agree with Mike or didn't like his style of coaching. But if you read between the lines, you can see that there was clearly a rift of some sort between Mike and a lot of the players. Last night, Keon talked to reporters about one of the differences in coaching styles between Mike and Doug Christie, saying that the faith that Doug has in me to play through mistakes and correct myself is huge. So clearly, Keon was on a short leash with Mike. Why that was? Who knows? But that's just one example of the costly mistakes Mike Brown was making during this season. And I do want to talk about Mike and the decision to fire him and the embarrassing way the Kings front office went about firing him and the kind of big picture implications of what all this means, how it affects De'Aaron Fox's future with the team, all of that. But I'm saving that for another video that will be coming out within the next couple days, so keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, I really want to talk about how great the Kings have been playing during these last 5 games. And I know I'm setting myself up for more pain, but the Kings have reeled me back in, man. I'm a believer again. And by believer, I mean, I believe we can be a play-in team as currently constructed. But if we actually make a couple moves, I could see us being in the mix for the 4 or 5 seed. As it currently stands, we're half a game back of the play-in. We're a game and a half back of the 8 seed. And we're 3 games back of the 4 seed. So we're right there. We really are. What a difference a couple weeks make. As of today, the Kings are 7th in offensive rating and 16th in defensive rating, which is good for the 9th highest net rating in the NBA. Pretty good for the 11th best team in the West. Now, obviously the Kings' numbers still look good this year while Mike was the coach, but we just weren't executing in crunch time. I believe we were 3-10 or 3-11 or something close to that in games decided by 5 points or fewer. Well, during this 5-game winning streak, the Kings have beaten the Mavericks by 10, which isn't 5, but it's close. They beat the Sixers by 6, of course, which, obviously that doesn't count, but they ended the game on a 15-0 run, which at the very least counts as performing well in the clutch. And then they beat the Grizzlies by 5 in a very hard-fought physical game, so that's another clutch time win. Beat the Warriors by 30, which is way better than 5, and then beat the Heat by 5 in double overtime, and that was one of, if not the best game of the season for the Kings, at least from an entertainment perspective. But also from a heart and hustle perspective as well. They showed a ton of fight, and that's really been the common factor here since Doug took over. Everybody's bought in, everybody's playing for each other, and everybody is playing hard, the whole game. not just for stretches here and there. And obviously, the stats haven't changed much. It's not like the Kings just all of a sudden started scoring 130 a night and became a top 5 defense, but they've scrapped and fought for every win they've gotten. And I don't know, man. I mean, that might be the difference between winning and losing those close games. I hate being the guy that's like, well, see, they're just trying harder now. Because, obviously, it's not that simple. And also, they were definitely trying to win when Mike was the coach. And the other thing to keep in mind as well, this is just 5 games. It's a very small sample size. But if you've watched the Kings this season, and especially during these last few weeks, it is very clear something is different. There's a different energy. That the talent has always been there, but I think Doug is letting the guys play a little freer and obviously not getting on them for making mistakes. He's a very positive dude, and we've seen that evolution in coaching happen these last 10, 15 years across all the major sports. You don't see those hard-nosed, do-as-I-say, kind of militaristic coaches anymore. It's all about player empowerment, especially in baseball. You want a guy who is diplomatic and can make sure the locker room is gelling and happy at all times, and Doug fits that script. He's also a former player, so the guys can relate to him better than they could with Mike. And I mean, Malik said that himself, word for word. They got something cooking in that locker room, man. I don't know what it is, but it smells good. And the fact that the Kings just pulled off a 17-point double OT comeback victory on the second night of a back-to-back with no De'Aaron Fox, it's pretty incredible. Especially after all the turmoil and negative media the Kings were facing this past month or so. Mike might have lost the locker room, but Doug sure as hell has found it, and the Kings are bought in. I'm bought in, for the most part. We got the Celtics up next in Boston, but if they win that game, Doug Christie better run for mayor, because Sacramento's going to be buying whatever he is selling. I'll have another video up at some point this week. Keep an eye out for that. And if the Kings beat the Celtics, you best believe I'll have a reaction up that night, saying some pretty crazy things. Might have to look at what NBA Finals tickets are going for these days. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Go Kings, and light the beam.